All right, thank you, Mark. And so now we are going to introduce the keynote speaker, who's the author of this book. So I'm pretty sure that you might have caught up with Dr. Reynolds during the break as well. I'm just going to actually read the bio that he's got together rather than what I might have put together. So Dr. Reynolds was first listed in the International Who's Who Historical Society in 2006 and has been published in the areas of politics, business and education. Dr. Reynolds completed his PhD and master's degrees at Claremont Graduate University, one of America's most prestigious universities, where he was heavily influenced by leading academics Peter Drucker and Alvin Toffler. He was also privileged to study with Leonard Levy, America's foremost historian on constitutional law. Dr. Reynolds has held appointments with both the United States Senate and House of Representatives as senior professional staff and worked directly with Senators Teddy Kennedy, Dan Coates and Mitch McConnell. Dr. Reynolds worked on several projects with White House staff, receiving a commendation from President Ronald Reagan. He has also worked on several major US political campaigns. In Australia, Dr. Reynolds held the position of Executive Officer for the New South Wales Minister for Public Works, Ports, Roads and Darling Harbour, and was then the Executive Director of the World Trade Centre, Sydney. Christopher has been a school teacher, university professor, business manager and political strategist, and has applied his breadth of knowledge and experience to writing of What a Capital Idea, Australia, 1770-1901. And I'm also informed by Dr. Reynolds that he's got a letter from the King thanking him for a copy of his book as well. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Reynolds to the stage now.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? As long as I can see everything all right, we'll be doing okay. Our Constitution. What a phenomenal document. It starts off, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the crown of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain and Ireland, and under the Constitution hereby established, this Constitution of Australia. And that's how it starts, with the states creating a federal parliament. And as Stephen was pointing out to you, it gets to the point of who's got what power, and I believe he was reading 61 to 63 in the Constitution. It says, the provisions of this Constitution, referring to the Governor-General in Council, shall be construed as referring to the Governor-General acting with the advice of the Federal Executive Council. Now here's the problem. There isn't an Executive Council anymore. And the Governor-General doesn't have any power anymore. I got in a conversation with the former Governor-General, His Excellency General Sir Peter Cosgrove, and we were sharing a beer and standing around the New South Wales Parliament, and I raised the topic of how did you get on being Governor-General? Good topic, you think, beer in your hand. And he said, I went off to America. I had to go to a funeral or something. And he said, while I was there, he said, I couldn't represent Australia. There was nothing I could do. They wouldn't let me speak at anything representing Australia. And I'm the Governor-General. And I said, well, mate, they reduced that office, in case you didn't know beforehand, to the position of a cipher. You have no power. And in fact, I should have said this to him, you've been reduced to the auto pen. Good line, but that's all it is. Because when I was working for the New South Wales government, it was Thursday afternoons that the ministers, and they would select a few. It's your turn, Bob and Gary. You go over and see the Governor-General. And over a glass of wine on a Thursday evening, he would sign whatever he had been given. He had lost. The Governor-General in this country has no power. And how do we get to this position? Let me just give a really brief idea of how we got to who we are as an Australian government. Let me start with an early date, 1215, that far enough back, where these barons protested against King John. King Richard, his brother, was off fighting in the Middle East with the Crusades. So John took over, and he was a rat bag is a good word, as we understand that. Anyway, he was doing a lot of things that upset the barons, the people with all the money that gave the king to do the Crusades. So the barons wrote this thing called the Magna Carta and said, you will sign it. And there are a number of copies of this document. And one of them, when you walk in, if you ever have the opportunity, when you walk into the US Congress and that big dome that you see when you come in, there's nothing in that room anymore except tourists. Anyway, if you sort of avoid the tourists, just inside the door on the right is this glass cabinet. So over I wanted to have a look, and it's a copy of the Magna Carta from 1215 is in the US Congress. Now, with this document, when it started, it was to separate powers and say to the king, you will not run the government. You will not run this country. You will have limited power, and we will form a parliament. And you will not write the law. We will. And we will enforce the law. You can see how powerful it was for him or them in that stage. The next big turn in this story of how we get to be where we are is around the year of 1776, where a group of Scots had had enough of paying taxes to the English, and they wanted to import their goods for nothing and didn't like the import duties, and so the war started. But with Jefferson, Hamilton, Jay, Adams, they are, when I look back on their writing, these young men were brilliant. There's absolutely no doubt about the phenomenal work that they put into writing the US Constitution. It is a brilliant document. And they took the whole idea from the Greeks and the Senate and the Caesar and democracy, and then added a few bits and pieces, and they really did want to separate out the powers. Here is the executive officer who runs the government. He does the finance. Here is the legislature who writes the laws. And here is the court. And we will limit their powers, and we will limit the time that they have. Now that then comes to influence the Australian situation. And this is where we begin this phenomenal story of the Australian Constitution. When Stephen said, I want you to come and talk about the Australian Constitution, I thought, people are going to be bored to death, when you think about all those clauses. But I know what happened, not just the clauses, it was the end result. And they decided to have these conferences, conventions, so that they could discuss having a constitution. Now, the thing about it was that it didn't take long after they wrote the New South Wales Constitution. I left something very important out. The first constitution that the British Parliament ever enacted was the Constitution for New South Wales. And William Wentworth wrote this thing, and it's this incredible story of how he moves it up and gets it through the Parliament. The first constitution through the British Parliament was for the Constitution of New South Wales, and the other states, South Australia included, followed it within 12 months to 2 years. Everybody had one. Now, that constitution out of New South Wales, whatever, 1850, what are we up to? If that's 1850, 170 years, has had only 9 little amendments in 150 years to do with, what time we close the door or something. It absolutely has not been touched in that 150 years. That's what a good document was. So, all right, we come up to the point that we're going to have the Australian Constitution. And the thing was that since 1860-ish, Earl Grey, had been absolutely beside himself and wanting the Australian colonies to federate because he was sick to bloody death of all the colonies writing all these letters to him. He just couldn't stand them all writing and complaining about the other people and the other things. He said, federate, I've only got to deal with one government. Now, that was the 1860. So another 40-odd years later-ish, they decided that, well, we might have a look at this and see if there's something in it. And I thought, when I studied politics and did my PhD, I had a professor say to me, follow the money trail. Nothing happens in politics, he said to me, without the money. Go back and look for the money. Where was the money in the Australian Constitution? Well, it turned out there was. And Victoria was broke. And it didn't have enough money to pay its way. And it was actually looking to federate. If we get a federal government, we can push the debt off to the federal government. And I thought to myself, nothing's changed much, has it? Nothing's changed much. And that was the real reason that Victoria then took New South Wales, and then the other states basically had to follow. But here's the interesting thing. They're going to have this first convention, 1891. But there's this young fella by the name of Andrew Inglis Clark, who's the Attorney General in Tasmania. And he started an American club. And I had to think about that, how many people would you get to join an American club in Hobart in 1890? Probably include a few penguins. What would you do to get up the numbers for your committee? I was thinking. But there he was with this thing about the American club, and he was right into the American Constitution, and he had his club. Well, anyway, he had to go off and defend. Somebody was suing Tasmania, and he had to go off and defend Tasmania in the courts in London. And on the way back, he stopped into Washington, talked to some of the big minds about things, and then he showed up just days before the first constitutional convention in Australia in 1891 was about to start. So in he walked, like, me getting off the plane this morning, sort of looking for where he's supposed to sit. And of course, it had already sort of started. And here are the premiers of the state. Oh, hello, George. How are you, mate? Haven't seen you in a while. And how are you getting on in that little state of yours? What did you call it? Oh, South Australia, sort of thing. Oh, well, it's nearly morning tea time, and we've got all week to sort of think about things here. And oh, there you are, Mr. Deacon. And how's New South Wales going? And so they were getting ready for their sit-in sort of thing. Have you ever been to these conferences that go on for weeks? So here they were, sort of fluffing the feathers and pushing the twigs around in the nest. And Andrew walks in, all flustered. He's just arrived. And he walks up to the table. I can do this. He walks up to the table for all these premiers, and while they're all wondering about what's on for morning tea, he looked at these fellas and he slapped 98 clauses for a constitution on the table. They didn't know what to do. It's actually this. This is an original copy of the Australian Constitution that someone's typed out so I can read it. And this is what they wrote. And he wrote, 75 to 80% of the Constitution we have today comes from one man. Henry Parkes was dead. He didn't put one word in it. And we only have one founding father, and that's Andrew Clark from Tasmania. Nobody else contributed other than a few clauses to the document, and our children are not taught about it, and most of us in the room have never even heard of our only founding father. And while they're looking at this document going, the bugger's written it, have a look at this, George, he's written it. And then he said, well, what about a name? Have you thought about a name? And they said, what? Well, we have to call it the Commonwealth of Australia. Well, the Commonwealth of Australia, and he said, yes, well, that's what the British do. You have the Commonwealth of Virginia and the Commonwealth of Delaware and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They like the name Commonwealth, so we'll have to be the Commonwealth of Australia. And while they were scratching their heads at this, he opened his satchel, pulled out an old rag, held it up and said, and what about this for a flag? The flag, the name and the Constitution come from one man, and we have never heard of him. It's an absolute disgrace. Now, the thing about that Constitution is that he picked up the American aspect, the strong fundamental of the separation of powers. And he wrote the sections so that this was the executive office, the Parliament, and the legislature, and the courts. And it's there in the Constitution. It's not muddled around like you ought to read the Irish Constitution. It's not muddled around. You've got the three distinct separation of powers for good reasons. It goes back to the Magna Carta and all the way back to the Romans. And that's the three sense of power. And he put it there. And then Stephen read to you what happened. In number 63, I'm not going to be able to find it quickly, it says that the Governor-General shall operate and do all of this and run the government, and he shall select those people who are the secretaries of state and the appointees, the officers. He shall appoint the officers and the secretaries of state, like they do in America, who will be responsible to him and hold offices at his good pleasure. Two sentences, the third sentence comes as somebody adds it, and they go and write in, and each of the secretaries of state or ministers of state shall be members of the Senate or the Parliament. And it neutralises the rest of the document. Someone has put it in, and it's not Andrew. That one clause, because as I kept reading this and studied this, because I did it for my PhD on all of this stuff, I could see that we had this whopping great party in 1901, and it passed through the British Parliament, 1900, 1901. Thousands of people all came out to celebrate that we were an independent country. Well, after the after party and the election, and the politicians stood there, it seems to me that they didn't read it because they didn't understand it, and they just reverted back to the old system of the Westminster government, and they then went and divided our parliament into a dueling duology of just the upper house and the lower house, and then the two parties. Now, when I went to look at the Constitution and the problems that we got today, there's three things that I want to say. The first thing is to look at the distribution of power in the Parliament. And when we look at the distribution of power, we all know how it operates. It becomes clear that we have a non-functioning executive office. Mr. Autopen doesn't even know who the officers running the departments are. He just sits there and goes and opens things or flower shows or whatever else they tell him to do. But he does no longer have the power that's given to him in that Constitution. But instead, in the after party, they said, well, we'll have to have parties. We'll have to have a Prime Minister. But in this document, there is no mention of a Prime Minister. There is no mention of a cabinet, and there is no mention in our Constitution of a party. Yet these three entities run our country. The office of Prime Minister is absolutely illegitimate. The officers in the cabinet are illegitimate. They are not in our Constitution, and yet we have them. And when you say, well, how can we operate like this if it's not in the Constitution? And the answer is simple. Oh, it's convention, dear boy. It's cricket, We sort of do this by convention. That's what we've always done. When did we always do it? You're a new country. This is 1901. You have a constitution that sets you independence like you're America, and you want to go and be a Westminster system again. And so they've just walked all over and ignored the Constitution that we have. So the Constitution that we signed up for is not the government we got. The government we signed up for is not the government that we've got. And here then begins the problem. Because you see, not only do we have this dueling going on between the whoever's in government and the rest are in opposition, and whatever the government wants to do, then the opposition says, well, we don't like it. No matter what the government says, the other crowd have to say, we don't like it. Unless, this wartime and we'll, meet in the bar and we'll have a chat about it or something, and those sort of things go on. So we end up with this sort of oligarchy like Coles and Woolworths running the country, and we've got these two major parties. And where do they get the money to keep themselves in power? They tax us. They use taxation money, and every bank will lend them money for their campaigns because they're guaranteed to get it back because they've written the laws to support the two parties. Even to the point, wasn't there something last year, that they've written some more clauses in to try and stop the smaller parties getting in? I mean, it's disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful that we continue to feed this horrible animal that just wants to have the conflict. Well, you get in this week and I'll be in next week, and we've got this horrible thing. But it gets worse because we don't just have this oligarchy between the two powers. It means that because we've got this entity called the Prime Minister who tells his cabinet what to do, who tells the Parliament what to do, who tells Mr Autopen what he should sign, that we have one individual, regardless of the party, even with what's his name that was here, that I've even forgotten his name, the Prime Minister before this Prime Minister? Morrison, thank you very much, I knew. Morrison decides he wants to be all these other ministers. I mean, the power. We have an autocracy. One man in this country has more power than the British King and more power than the American president. He can wake up on Tuesday morning and decide that we're going to recognise a Palestinian state. Oh, where did you get that idea? Well, I just thought of it, didn't I? I was on a plane and we were going off to somewhere. Oh, the UN. We thought that'd be a good idea. I mean, there's people in the party that'll vote for that. Oh, and the whole idea of nobody under the age of 16 can have access to the internet. That sounds a good one too, Is anybody else of that opinion? Oh, I didn't hear that. We just move ahead. And think of all the other things, as we heard before, that are just moving through the parliament that we don't even know. And so it becomes this sort of constant thing of all these secret things being exposed on this absolutely fiasco that's called our parliament. We have a major problem in the distribution of power across our federal government. Now, the second point of our problem is the distribution of power across our states. We think that we have a sovereign country. We don't, because legally we have a system of government called shared sovereignty. You see, each of the states have their constitutions, as they were colonies, by acts of the British Parliament. Our federal government exists through an act of the British Parliament. It has no more legal weight than the acts that were given to create each of the states. And it was the states that created the federal government, or agreed to form the federal government. When King Charles became king, you may remember the Queen was dead, long live the King. Well, the federal government had to get out the troops and read a declaration. I don't know if you saw all of that, but the troops came and marched, and the Governor-General stood there and said, I'm announcing that the Queen is dead, long live the King. But they didn't do that just for the federal government. in South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, if I've got any, Western Australia, in each of those states, they had to have the same ceremony. The troops marched, the governor came out, and the governor then read the declaration declaring that South Australia or Queensland submits to the fact that King Charles was now the King of Australia and each of the states. They have as much power legally as the federal government. So we could ask what happened, of course, is that slowly but surely there's a principle under the separation of power doctrine, and it says those powers which are not extended to a federal government are retained, which is a big principle in America. Those powers which are not given are retained. And it's the same in our document, our Constitution. But slowly but surely, we've lost those powers. And the first and main one was the power of taxation. Oh, there's a war on, and we have to take all the taxation and tax income. And so, because there's an emergency, we'll take income tax. Well, they never bothered to stop taking income tax. And of course now it's the federal government that gives back to the states what was theirs in the first place by constitutional law. So we lost our power, and even other things like education. I'm talking to David Christofouli, who's now the Premier of Queensland. And I said to him, he gave a lovely speech somewhere, and I said, David, we have to take back the power of education for this state. We've got to get it back so we can fix the education system. He said, you're exactly right, and we've got to do it. He said, I want you to do it. I said, are there any witnesses to this? Well, 9 months later, I'm still waiting for the phone to ring. He has, and so do you in South Australia, the right and the power to look after your own education because it's in the Constitution that it's your right and your power. And it's a mess when it comes to the Australian curriculum and how education is going down the toilet because of what's going on. The third aspect that's important about understanding our government is the use or the abuse of power that goes on across our country. Now, when these people get elected to being ministers, whether they're state or federal, you may have noticed that they're not qualified in the sort of areas that they've got. When they want to appoint Jacinta Bryce to be finance minister, why? Why? She's a great person, but how on earth would she be the Minister for Finance? Of course she can't. We just moved the boys and the girls up the chain. Not in the American system, of course, as you know. If the President says, I want these dozen people to be my secretaries of state, he not only gets to appoint them, but they have to be tested by the Senate before they're appointed. There's a process before they get the job. Not here. And it's actually that bureaucracy that continues to run our government. Nameless, faceless, unsuable people on incredibly high wages that are actually telling these poor sods, ministers, what they should be doing and how they should be doing it. You don't think these guys and girls all show up with all this legislation because they wrote it or even read it. They only report what they should be saying about what the department is already wanting to do. And when I remember working for a young minister in New South Wales, he sat down and he was so excited to actually be the minister, and he was going to do something, and he was all ready for it. And then the bureaucrat said to him, it's a great idea, Minister. We're right behind you, but we have this financial setting or schedule that's going to take a few years. So if you just wait for this sort of schedule of financial spending to run out, which is about 3 years, then we can actually put your new good idea on the schedule for the next 3 years. There was nothing he was going to be able to do to affect the departments that he was supposed to be running to spend any money for the next 3 years. He was a lame duck from the time that he got the job. And I was his executive officer, right? Trying to do things around them. Well, luckily I got on well with the departments. And we were able to talk to them. I was able to talk to them to get some things done. But these poor fellas and ladies are just railroaded. And it comes because in the 20s and the 1920s and 30s, there was a guy called Talcott Parsons. And this guy came up with a whole thing called systems theory or functionalism. And this is where you have lots of little boxes and you do another line to another little box and another little box. You ever seen those sort of things? And whatever it's called function, where all of those little boxes are related and regulated. So the language of the functionalists have to do with regulations, obligations, you must do this, relationships, all of that sort of stuff is a particular way that you understand the world. And it has overrun our bureaucracies in this country and others. So yes, we'd like to do that, but you see, we'll have to get it to another committee, and that committee will talk to that committee. You heard this before. And it just seems impossible to be fighting against this functionalism to get anything done. So when it comes to what can be done, there are those that want to say, oh, we need to have a republic. Republic is what we need to do. But you've got to watch who's saying what, because there's been a move in this country against the British virtually from the day we started. The Irish and the Scots still don't like the British, but they brought the politics here. And so when you find that the good Irish Catholics, and I'm of that background, by the way, that sort of say, we've got to get rid of the British. It's an old song, but you've got to leave your old fights in your old country. And just because you want to say we want a republic because we have to have independence, here's the news. We became fully, totally independent from England in 1986 with the Australia Act. That's it, England said. We'll have nothing to do with you. And that's when we get the king, because we needed one because the Constitution said we needed a monarch, to become the king of Australia and not the king of Britain. So he then puts on that hat for Australia, and of course there's 27 other countries, so he's got all these different hats of who he's king with this week to help with their constitutions and functional things. So we finished that. Now when I actually got into the Australian Act written by Australia, it's not the same as the document that was written by the British that is the Act. They doctored it by the time it came to you and me. And then when I got to how then it got to the states, because they all had to agree to it. Remember, the states have power. In this document, as it's supposed to say, yes, all right, we'll agree to have nothing to do with the Australian Federal Parliament. God bless you all in what you're doing. When it came to the business about the states, it says, and we will maintain our control and interest in the states, and our people. And when we arrive, you will roll out the red carpet as usual and get down and kiss our foot as you always have. Doesn't quite like that, but it means that just because they eliminated the relationship with the federal government, the act coming from England doesn't write off the relationship with the British government and the states. Because why? The states are independent political bodies. And we've sort of lost that understanding. If we think we're just going to become a republic to cut off the British from Australia, we're making a massive mistake. If, however, we thought that if we want to get rid of the Westminster system, if we want to have an executive power and government whereby we actually have an elected president, a person who actually is running the fiscal policy and the activities and the government of the country, then yes, if you even talk to any constitutional lawyer, they'll say the Americans have the best model. Now, I know we watch the television and we see the conflict that goes on between the different branches of the government, but it's a very healthy system of government because they've got that conflict and they want to be able to have that conflict and not just as we have an autocrat just making the decisions as they've got. So while they have conflict, they still end up running a government and everything gets known, it's transparent. So when it comes to, we look at this constitution and we say, well, how on earth do we make a move? What have we got to do? It happens because we start a movement where we fall in love with our country again and our pride, and we get to know our history. We are so vulnerable to the insults and the slings and the people who would even march on Australia Day against us because we don't know our history. We don't know our history. We don't know our constitution. We don't know who wrote it. We don't even understand how Arthur Phillip arrived or the phenomenal man that Macquarie was and how he invented this country to become a great nation. Oh, we know the name, but what made him great? And we've lost it. I've spent 6 years, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for 6 years getting into original documents. I was not going to be satisfied with anything that's written in the last 40 years because they just kept spinning it around amongst themselves. I wanted original documents. 600 books and articles I read, 300 I quote, and at least 100 of those are more than 100 years old. And the earliest is 1595, an original document that affects this country. I was seriously going to discover our history and this phenomenal country that we are. And when it came to the Constitution, what makes it a phenomenal document? It's a phenomenal document and story because it says that we, the people, we voted in a referendum to form a country. We, the people, own the government. We, the people, own the country. And we, the people, have one country, we have one government, and we have one flag. It is time that we, the people, took back our country. God save the King. Thank you.